Okay, I'm in the mudroom and I'm getting my gear on, heading out to do soil testing. We are part of a multi-year study on climate change and its impact to agriculture and the sequestration of carbon in soil with different farming practices. It's called a PASA. I forget what that stands for. Sustainable Agriculture Study. This is our second year in it. It's a 5-year study for us. I think it's been going on will have been going on for 8 years by the time we're done. And so it requires a yearly soil test, which we do anyway, to help us identify the shortcomings in minerals and nutrients in the forage, and to make sure that our very acidic coastal Maine soils get enough lime or neutralizing element to help them grow the best grass and best clover, which also helps release the minerals and nutrients and proteins that are required to make good milk. So I like to sample and study the results of soil tests at least once a year. There was a period there where we didn't do it often, like every few years, and at one point early on here on the farm, for some reason I just did one test for the entire farm, which later on I realized how useless that was. You actually have to test each field, which is what we're going to go do now. And also there are different soil test protocols. Different labs or universities do different things. So we're actually sending soil in to Cornell to do the soil carbon sequestration study. And it's a very thorough, in-depth profile of the soil and all the breakdown of carbon and protein and nutrients and calcium and acidity and all those micronutrients and things. But I'll also send the soil test to Maine, which is a more standard soil test. Maybe I can show the difference here in two different places between the two tests from last year. And that gives me the PASA test to Cornell will go away, and I won't find out about that for months. The soil test from UMaine will come back in about a month, and I'll be able to then predict what I need to do in the spring, how much lime I need to put on, and other adjustments. Now, this was a very wet year, so I'll be sampling, and we just had 2 inches of rain in already saturated soil. So we'll have to go out, we'll see the condition of the soil when I'm sampling it and determine whether it's too wet to pack for shipping. I may have to dry it on some newspaper and just let some of that moisture cook off. I'm a little late in doing this test only because it's been so wet. We've had so many rainy days. Been trying to give a chance for the soil to dry out a little bit. But you can't take the soil test once the soil freezes, because there's a certain biological component plus the ability to dig down and get to the right levels for the test. And so I'm kind of at the last day. It's going to be really cold tonight and super cold tomorrow, and the ground probably will freeze, at least the crust, 6-8 inch crust where I need to be doing the sampling. So I'm going to head out. I got to clean the soil sampling setup that I have, get a few things ready, and then we're going to sample. And so when you sample a field, you want to do like an inverted W or an M shape across the width of the field and take a minimum of 10 samples, usually in pairs. There's a little graphic I'll share of that. And also, I'll show you the rig that I use, which gives a good deep profile and is fairly simple and fast. That's the other thing. I like to take more samples than less. And you also have to be careful where you take the sample. You don't want to obviously sample right in a manure pat. You don't want to sample in a low wet spot where nutrients may congregate artificially. So you want to get a good cross representation of the soil profile throughout the field and the nutrients. And so I'll be testing 3 fields here on the home farm today. I've got a lot of other stuff to do. Normally, I would also go and just make a day of it and sample the soil in all of the hay fields that we manage. I really wanted to do that this winter, but given how everything's played out, I think I'll just wait and do those in the spring. I know they all need amendments, and so I want to do that right. I don't want to rush it. I have a lot on in the next week, so I don't want to take even an extra couple hours to go do those other fields right now. But I have to get the PASA test in and done today before the soil freezes for the home farm, because that is a study that we're involved in, and I feel is very important. And also because of that, because we participate in that study, it makes us available to some funding and some educational opportunities and some workshops that I've been taking part in. And so it's part of a much bigger process, which I'm dedicated to being involved in. And along that, I was really holding out. We have a couple pieces of leprechaun technology that we're going to share with you. That's one is on its way from Ireland right now, and one has already arrived, but we'll do a separate video and show that if we haven't already seen it by now. And one of those pieces I was really hoping to get before I did the soil testing, and I was kind of holding out, but it's just not going to arrive in time. It'll be here at the end of the month, a couple days from now, but I need to get this done today. So we're going to head out and clean the soil bucket and sampling setup. So we want to make sure there's no contamination from previous soil tests, or just dust and dirt and things that may have gotten into the setup. And also when in between each field, I want to make sure I clean it and the setup and make sure that there's no cross-contamination, as it were, because we want real results. Isolate even cross-mixing or between fields can throw off the results, or dust or contamination from grain or any residue that may be around on the testing equipment can all throw the test way off, and we don't want to do that. We want actual results. We want as good a quality test as possible, because this really is the bottom line, is our livelihood. Because if we get the components in the soil wrong and can't grow the grass that we need to feed the cows, to make the milk, to make the cheese, then that's a bad thing. So we really want to know this. So away we go. You'll notice I'm wearing an orange coat. Not only is this one of my favorite coats, because it is kind of warm and windbreaky and weatherproof, and despite it being horribly torn, it is a tear-resistant coat, which is great in the brambles and things out in the forest. It does lack a certain amount of pockets, but I've got to take these bags and a pen with me, so I'm going to put that in my bib pocket. But it's also hunting season, so I want to make sure I'm easily identifiable and won't get shocked. Okay, my soil testing setup consists of a 3/4 inch auger drill and a bucket with a pipe threaded in the bottom of it that goes all the way through. And this is a 3/4 inch pipe, and the bit just fits in there. The idea is the bit goes through and then pulls out soil up into the bucket, and then there's probably can't really see, there's a slot going through on either side of the pipe that allows the soil to spill out into the bucket. And then the other part of the kit is a different bucket to pour all those samples in, and then you have to mix the samples thoroughly. And want about a cup of soil from each pair of samples to go in the test. For the PASA test, at least, we have to do 5 cups from each field to send in. So I'll also have to find something that represents like a cup measure and bring that with me. But you can see both these buckets are dirty, so I'm going to go ahead and give these a swizzle around with a little bit of cleaner and get them clean, and then we'll go from there. So we are testing 3 pastures, and they're all in permanent grass, or one of them is still undergoing some transformation, but the areas I'll be sampling are in permanent grass. And I forgot to mention a couple other tools that we use to do this job. Obviously, for the drill, we need a cordless drill. And I also grabbed a small spade just to mix the stuff up in the bucket once we get samples. The first field is the one just below the barns, and it's a long and narrow field that goes out into the silva pasture through the woods and down to the bridge. And so I'll go down this side and then come up the second field over there and then out into the main field up at the top. Now, the one problem with the ground and the field here is it's saturated. So I want to make sure I don't check in any of these wet spots. And I also do have to keep an eye out, like those brown areas, I don't want to measure there because that's abnormal. I should really start up there, but I have a feeling going forward that area is going to change. So I don't necessarily care about what happens up there. There's going to be some changes. So for now, I'll just focus on this little section. I'll probably take 2 samples here. And this section of the forest I kind of view as rooms. We sort of divide it off into half-acre paddocks and let the cows graze in sections. So we'll do 5 of the sections going down towards the bridge, 2 samples from each section. Maybe I'll do more, just see, because I have to send in a cup from each sample site. So 5 cups total per field. So that's 10 samples if we do it 2 samples per section. So we'll just see. I may actually do more just to give a good cross section. Okay, I did not expect this. It is so wet that this isn't working. The drill is just clogging up with mud and it's not depositing anything, and I'm actually not getting a sample. So tip of the drill looks like that, caked in mud. I've never had this happen before in many years of doing this method. And so I may have to use that spade to take the samples, which I am not happy about. That's a lot of holes to dig. Well, let's just hope it's this section of this field, which always is wet. Even in a dry time, this section of the field can be wet. So I guess I'm just gonna have to do a little bit of soil sampling the old-fashioned way, as it were. Okay, there's our first sample, and I'm gonna make sure I don't include any organic matter. I'll take that worm out of there too. And basically we just mix this up. This is the 2 samples for the first group. It is so wet. So ideally I need about a cup of that, and I'll put it in my plastic bag and save for later. And now I have 8 more samples from this field to do, and 20 more samples across the rest of the farm. So I'm just gonna crack on and do this, and we'll show some results at the end. I guess there was never gonna be a time this year when the fields weren't as wet as they are now. They've pretty much been this wet or wetter all year long, so I guess I should have figured that my drill method wasn't gonna work. I wish I had thought about that and bought a proper spade, because the little gardening trowel I have here is backbreaking to dig down in the holes and get on my hands and knees. I could have used if you use a slender, one of those spades that's slender and long, about 2 feet deep, only about 4 inches wide, that's the tool to use when you have to dig holes for sampling. But I don't have one of those, so I'm going to go ahead and do it this way. A couple other things I should point out is you don't want to do the sampling right up against the field border or along trees, because that's an artificially high concentration of leaf drop and everything. You want to take it from the middle of the field, no low spots, no high spots, no manure. The other thing I have kind of been looking forward to soil sampling, other than the fact that the weather has limited my ability to do it, is because I get a chance to go out and walk the field and see the conditions. It's been a month and a half since the cows have been out on grass, so I won't have to, so I will be encountering and looking at the regrowth since they stopped grazing and the condition of the fields. Now, be mindful, I wasn't able to spread manure except once this year on a couple of the fields. The cows did the rest of the work themselves, but it was so wet I couldn't apply nutrients. So these fields may show a deficiency this year as opposed to last year. It'll be interesting to see. But there is a high level of clover in all my fields, so that also helps boost the nitrogen levels. So we'll just have to see what happens when we get the results back. But I do like this procedure or doing this work because it gets me in contact with the land and the fields, and I'm out here on a beautiful day like today. So with my trowel method, I want to make sure I scrape back any grass and get a clean opening. Now the problem is we have very rocky soil. I want to peel back any of the top layer. And then I want to take a slice vertically right down in through the profile. In this case, I'm going to have to really loosen it up because this is a particularly gravelly patch of soil. Make sure to pick out any bits of grass. And I also, in between each sample, I mix things up, and then I put the piece of sod back and make it look like I was never there. Another thing that's good to be helpful to know, and some soil labs require it, is to know the soil profile of what you're sampling. So in this case, I use an app on my phone from the Soil Web network, I believe, that works to geolocate the soil under my feet, basically wherever the phone is. So I think right here we're in a Brayton or Swanville muckies type soil. Well, I was wrong. We're a Peru soil right here. I know that in this area there is a stripe of muck soil because it behaves that way. Peru is actually a very stony, loamy type soil, very well drained, which is also part of the reason the grass is growing here so well. And the other reason for zigzagging and taking that inverted W or M shape sampling pattern with a pair of samples about 10 or 15 feet apart from each other is because soil can run in striations or bands of profile types. It just depends on how the glaciers laid out the soil and move things around. So if you were to do a straight line through a field, there's a good percentage of chance that you will just catch one type of soil in a field that may have many different soil profiles and structures, and therefore nutrient requirements and carbon requirements and nitrogen and things. So you do want to do a random pattern. So I literally just walked about 20 feet over and did another soil profile test, and we're right into Brayton, which defines this area out here, which is a very much more mucky section. It holds the water longer. Great in a drought, but in a year like this, it will be very sticky and claggy and wet. And that right there is pure fertility. Got a lot of nice roots. I'm not seeing worms, but it's so wet they may not be there. There's some grubs, but that is very fertile soil. High loam content. This is still Brayton right here. I'm in the next. This is my first of the pairs on the fourth set of samples. Let's cover that back up. You can go also online to the Soil Web survey site and put in your geographic location, your zip code, or actually your actual physical address, and it will print a map of all the different soil profiles on your farm or your yard or garden, wherever you are in the US anyway. And it's fairly accurate. Those maps were done, well, I think they may have been updated in the 80s, but they were originally done in the 30s using old stereoscope, the two pair of binocular microscope glasses and aerial photographs. And they went out and sent teams out to sample random sites, and then based on what they saw in the aerial photograph, they determined bands of soil profiles in these areas and then made generalizations. So in actual fact, like on our farm, there's a section here where the Peru and Brayton mix in with the Swanville muck soil, and I can't actually remember the term. It's a new name, a combination name that was reapplied to those areas where two soil profiles blend, and there's a kind of a mix of each. And there are very different growing requirements in that mixed section than in either of the other sections. It's very pronounced. I actually covered it up with a logging road, a riprap corduroy logging road, because it was always just soup, even in the middle of a dry summer. It would hold enough moisture. There was some kind of underground river, stream or something on the clay layer that caused that to always be wet. And so I just made the best out of a worse situation. But it was just this one tiny area where there was this convergence of different soil profiles that the map didn't get, but actually, which showed up in later editions. Along with the soil data for this climate study we do, we also submit land use. So certainly for these fields that I'm sampling right now, it's also, we record what kind of impact the land has had. In this case, it was merely grazing animals. How many times were the animals here grazing, for how long, and how many animals at what weight? So we're looking for study on soil compaction and damage. And then in the areas that I did mechanical work on last spring, I've recorded those impacts. And then any subsequent activity, manure spreading, lime spreading, any equipment, any livestock gets recorded as part of this soil sampling process. Okay, there's the first bag done. This is called the Tall Tree Field because it runs alongside Tall Tree Farm. And that is way too much soil to be sending in as a sample. But I'm breaking it up to send it to 2 labs. So I want to make sure, and I think each lab has a different amount of soil they require to do the tests. PASA test at Cornell lab requires 5 cups. So I think I put about 12 handfuls, big handfuls in there, just because I can then divide it up into a separate bag to send over to UMaine. And then I'll just spread the rest out in the garden up above. But that's the first field done, first set of 10 samples taken. This next set of fields is again in little rooms throughout the silvopasture setup and is vastly different. We have very open area of fields that I'll start with sampling down there, and then we move into this more thick woodland area where the cows were grazing. I do have to thin this out this winter, and I also have to plant when it's thinned and stoned and stumped. Then I can come through here and I can plant some better grass species to be able to feed the cows better. But they were able to graze this section, I think 3 or 4 times. It bought some time. And each time you graze the cows through here and pass them through, they deposit their manure, which adds to the nutrients in the ground and encourages the grasses to grow, and things start getting better. Before I did this, it used to look like behind me here, pretty much thick, dense, overcrowded forest. So I've opened it up, I've thinned it, I've left some tree canopy and some growth, and I've kind of connected the open meadow areas that were throughout here to create a more consistent grazing area. With the idea is that during hot summers, the cows can come down here. I can send them down here. It's easily 10 degrees cooler here halfway down the valley in the shade of the trees than it is in the big pasture up above or even in the barnyard. So on those hot summer days, I'd like to send them down here where there's some forage and it's cool and they can tuck themselves into some shady areas. Now, that is a climate mitigation strategy. And it's also, because this is halfway down the valley and heavier, muckier soil with less depth to the clay layer, it also holds water better. So yeah, in a wet year like this has been, it's been a disaster. But the 3 or 4 years of drought prior to this, it's been green down here where it started to go brown elsewhere. And so that is also one of those mitigation strategies. As climate changes, as weather patterns alter, I need to make sure that I always have food ahead of the cows to eat, or at a place where I can harvest it so they can eat during the winter. And that all, this soil testing, the field sampling that I'll be doing later on, and some mapping, all aids in collecting data to help look back and also hopefully predict future patterns that may be developing. Just come down here to the bridge. I haven't been down here for a couple months since I completed it, and there is a video coming out on the bridge eventually. The whole process from start to, well, where it's at now anyway. I still have work to do on it. Came down here to rinse out the bucket in the stream and wash off the spade here at the end of the fields, and now we'll go back sampling. I'm in a section of the forest pasture area where I had bale grazed the cows with the hay feeder down here in August. When it was so wet up above in the main field, they couldn't graze there. It was too wet. They would have ruined the field, and the grass was also slow in regrowth because it was so wet. There was an area here that needed some improvement. It was disturbed soil, a lot of weeds and things. So I just basically saturated the area with bales and cows and manure and just really packed them in here so they impacted this. And then I came through and stumped it, pulled any stones out, got this little area, about a quarter acre, not very big. But anyway, I covered it in a cover crop in September, which has taken off tremendously. I'd hoped it would get up to the normal height, but it was just so wet, and we didn't have the sun and the warmth to really lift this out of the ground. But I am happy with the cover that it's given. I had thought to graze the heifers down here, but it's just been so wet to get them to this point. They could come down the road, but it's really just, it's almost not worth setting up the lanes and everything and the fencing for them to be here for half a day. So I'm just going to leave it to cover. This will die down over the winter, and then I can overseed it in the spring, or some of the grasses, I think there's a winter rye in here. It may take off, and then I can replant. All this section is going to have to be replanted. And based on the soil tests that we get back, I will know what amendments and lime and amounts of manure to apply here to really get the crop to take off. I'm just mixing up the second soil sample for the pond field, and I'm just making sure that, well, I'm making sure no grass is in there, but I'm also reaching down and really mixing this up. I mixed it up several times while I was pulling the samples. I'm breaking up any chunks or clods, and I'm pulling out any stone or any clod that's bigger than an acorn, basically. And then this will be ready to put in the bag and call that done, and we've got one last set of samples to do. You can see here in the more established pasture that I've got to clear away more of the sod. We don't want to incorporate any of that into the soil sample and get a false result. I got to peel it back, slice through these roots, and pop down the rhizome structure away so I can clear a spot, and then I can take my sample. Now this is a low-lying area of the main pasture that has been a problem for a few years. It's very swampy. Now it's not a different soil profile than the rest of the field, at least by using the app. It doesn't show that. It could be that this is an isolated patch of glacial till that has a lot more clay closer to the surface, so it's not holding the water. It's also in a very low depression in the field, but it also could be a completely different type of soil structure that the mapping system never caught because it's an isolated little pocket here in the field. The other option is that when this field was last plowed about 8 years ago, just before we bought the place, that somehow it was disrupted and some bad soil was laid on top. More than likely, I kind of think that this area had a high, was like where they piled lime. that's kind of how it acts. Like there was lime sat here in this section of the field for a long time before it was distributed in the rest of the field. And that can also alter the characteristics of the soil. I'm going to try bale feeding on this once the ground is frozen. If I can get the cows out here, if we've got some nice days when it's about 20 degrees, and the ground is frozen solid, then I can send the cows out here on the snow, whatever, put some bales out here, let them eat it, let them manure, let them trample that hay in, and let it sit here so that in the spring it adds that extra fertility just to this spot. The other option is that I'm looking into for a long-term solution is to roll or subsoil this area with either a spiked aerator or a deep shank subsoiler, just to try and break up any compaction that's here to let this water through down and run out the rest of the way. It is, because it is such a low section, running subsoiler through here and going out may help create some drainage channels. Otherwise, the other option is to keep the cows from this section of the field and to plant some trees and put a fence line here. But that kind of spoils the whole idea of ever using this as a hay field if I make this a dedicated pasture. Right now, I kind of like the option to be able to graze here if necessary, graze here all the time, but also hay it if necessary to keep ahead of the cows grazing and make sure there's always fresh grass. And plus, a fence and trees, well, it does offer a shade option to the cows. It also means the management, the topping, you have to take care of the trees and the fence. It just adds a whole bunch of stuff that I'd rather not deal with. But if that's the solution, that's the direction we'll go. You just got to wait and see. Needless to say, I don't want a soil test in that low wet section. Not only is it going to be super wet, but also the compaction means that it's very anaerobic and very stale and very acidic there, and that would artificially throw off the sample for the rest of the field that isn't that way. So I want to leave that isolated and just know that it's an area of concern to deal with in the future, and that hopefully by improving the rest of the field, that will come along with it. In addition to field edges and laneways, areas and wet areas that you don't want to sample, you also don't want to sample gateways and anywhere where there's an additional area of compaction. Areas like that gate there where I come in and out to spread manure not only will have a higher concentration of manure as I fan out from there to go around the field, but it also has a higher level of compaction because of the amount of traffic there. So we want to avoid those areas and just stick towards the middle of the field where there's less compaction, less and more normal usage, you would say. Yeah, I've compacted it by spreading manure, by running animals, by driving across here with loads of logs and fencing supplies and things. But ideally, that's a more normal usage as opposed to headlands, field boundaries, anywhere where there isn't a normal activity of grazing or whatever the field's used for. To get an idea, sample sizes, that is too much. I mean, I only need 5 cups of that to go to the PASA study and about 5 cups to go to the UMaine study soil test. But this is still the bucket, about almost 3 gallons of soil left from all the 10 sample sites in the field. So that'll go get spread back out on the garden probably, and the soil test will get put inside for the moment. Well, there's our soil test from the 3 fields. Enough to send off to 2 different labs and probably put some back in the garden. I will divide these up later. It's Friday today. This is taking a couple hours when all's said and done. So I've got other things I'm going to go do. But tonight or over the weekend, I'll divide these up and package them ready to ship on Monday. It's best to ship soil samples at the beginning of the week, so they have a chance to arrive and get to the lab and then put in for testing. The testing takes a while. You don't want to mail it on a Friday and have it sit in the post office, either in an uninsulated building where it could freeze or in a place that's too hot where it could degrade the sample. So you want this to get to the destination of the sampling lab as soon as possible. So we'll ship these off on Monday to 2 different labs. As far as storing them in the house, we want to put these at room temperature, out of direct sunlight, somewhere. I will determine tonight. I'll leave these sealed up in the baggies, and I'll determine tonight whether they need to be, if they're too wet. Basically, if you squeeze the soil together and if it clings and forms or water seeps out, it's too wet. You want to spread it out on newspaper and let it dry out in the air in the house overnight, and then package them up. But I don't think it's too wet. Doesn't seem like it. Maybe it'll alter because it's in the baggie. And with all the samples, all the soil test sites, the subsamples mixed together for each field, it may be wetter than I think. But we'll check that tonight, and we'll get these sent off and find out what happens later.